They say life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, that even in the quietest, most predictable moments, there lurks a hidden spark, something poised to catch fire. I never would have believed it, certainly not for myself, but I suppose that's precisely the way it goes. Looking back, I can hardly recognize the woman I was just a few months ago, but I remember the day it all began as if it were yesterday. The memory rises unbidden as I stand here in my kitchen, making tea, hands trembling just a little. I can feel the ghost of a grin tugging at the corner of my mouth, a strange, bittersweet warmth blooming in my chest. It started with a leaky pipe in the guest bathroom. Such a small thing to cause so much upheaval. The leak had driven me to call in a repair service, a last-minute decision really. And that decision, well, it brought Jamal and Malik into my life, like a gust of wind through an open door. If you had asked me before, I'd have told you I was content. Married for nearly 30 years, a home in the suburbs, a husband who provided a predictable life, a good life. I wasn't unhappy exactly, just restless maybe. Walter, my husband, spent his days buried in his law practice, his energy spent by the time he returned each evening. Conversations became sparse, routine replaced romance, and the passions of our youth faded into a comfortable companionship, leaving me somewhere between complacency and yearning. And then, in walked Jamal. I can still picture the way he stood there as if he belonged, his gaze direct yet warm. He was here to fix a pipe, but in an instant he became so much more, something I didn't know I was searching for. And then Malik. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. The story I'm about to tell is not one of simple missteps or mistakes. I don't want your sympathy, nor your judgment. I've come to terms with what happened, though it took a toll I hadn't expected. My life, which had felt so settled, unraveled in ways I still struggled to comprehend. And even now, I wonder if it all could have ended differently, if I could have stopped myself from opening that door. But maybe, just maybe, some doors were meant to be opened. I suppose you'll have to decide for yourself. It was a gray Wednesday morning when the call came. Walter had left early, as usual, leaving me with a half-empty coffee cup and the silence of the house. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when I noticed a damp spot under the sink in the guest bathroom. It had grown larger over the past week, and now a steady drip was pooling on the tile. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, we'd had our fair share of repairs in the past months, and I hated the thought of another hassle. But with the dripping now unmistakable, I called the repair company, requesting someone be sent over as soon as possible. An hour later, a knock at the door. I opened it to find Jamal. He was young, mid-20s perhaps, with a lean build, the kind of confident stance that hinted at someone used to being looked at. His eyes were dark and steady, and he smiled, a warm, genuine expression that softened his otherwise intense features. He was dressed simply in jeans and a gray t-shirt, a tool belt slung low around his waist. "Morning, ma'am," he greeted, glancing past me into the house. "Got a call about a leak?" "Yes, thank you for coming on short notice," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "It's just down the hall in the guest bathroom." He followed me, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floors. There was a calmness about him, a sense of easygoing confidence that seemed at odds with his youth. I found myself stealing glances at him, noticing the ease in his movements, the slight curve of a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve. It was refreshing, somehow, to have someone so different from Walter here. Someone vibrant and unrestrained. As he worked, crouched under the sink with his back to me, I found myself lingering in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the play of muscles under his shirt as he twisted and tightened the pipe. I told myself it was just curiosity. After all, it wasn't every day that I had company, much less someone like him. "Shouldn't take too long," he said over his shoulder, catching me off guard. "Looks like just a loose fitting." I cleared my throat, shifting my weight. Oh, good. I was worried it might be something worse. He smiled again, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. Nah, you're lucky. This one's easy. Something about the way he looked at me in that moment, steady, unhurried, made me feel a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. A warmth, an awareness. I felt my cheeks flush slightly and I looked away, hoping he hadn't noticed. Do you get a lot of calls like this? I asked, trying to fill the silence. Pretty often. People think it's something major, but 9 times out of 10, it's an easy fix. I don't mind, though. Beats being stuck behind a desk. I laughed, a little nervously. I know the feeling. My husband works long hours in his office, buried in paperwork. I suppose it's nice to have some variety. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, the air between us felt charged, like static before a storm. It was absurd, of course. What was I doing, standing here talking to this stranger, feeling the stirrings of something that should have been long buried? But the moment passed as he turned back to his tools, leaving me standing there, with my thoughts whirling. Over the next few days, I couldn't seem to shake the memory of Jamal. The house felt emptier, and Walter's nightly silences seemed heavier. I told myself it was foolish, that it was only the novelty of meeting someone so different, someone who reminded me of the days when I was young and impulsive, before life became predictable. But the next morning, when I found myself checking the bathroom sink to see if the leak had returned, I realized I was looking for an excuse, some pretense to call him back. And I did. It was hardly a day later when Jamal returned, this time with an easy familiarity that both thrilled and unnerved me. The way he looked at me, appraising, knowing, left little to the imagination. He must have known what I was doing, that there was no real problem with the sink. But he said nothing, only smiled that same quiet smile as he set down his tools. As he worked, he asked about my life, my interests. It was so effortless, the way he listened, the way he seemed genuinely interested. I felt as though I were stepping into another world, one where I wasn't just Mrs. Winters, the wife of a successful lawyer, but someone with dreams and desires of her own. There were no explicit words exchanged, nothing overtly inappropriate. But when he finally finished, there was a lingering pause as he looked at me, his gaze warm, lingering just a moment too long. Anything else I can help you with? He asked, his voice low, almost intimate. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. In that instant, I felt a surge of recklessness, a desire to break free from the quiet, well-ordered life I'd built. And before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, my hand brushing against his. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The day after Jamal's visit, I found myself drifting through the house like a ghost, mind racing with thoughts I hardly dared entertain. Every corner of my home felt charged, each quiet room thick with memories of his presence. I hadn't felt this way in years, and it scared me as much as it thrilled me. Walter returned that evening, as he always did, exhausted from a long day at the firm. I watched him from across the dining table, his brow furrowed as he read through some files he'd brought home, barely acknowledging my presence. The distance between us had grown slowly over the years, a quiet erosion of intimacy. But now I could feel it with a painful clarity, each moment with him only making my mind turn back to Jamal. I knew it was wrong. I knew this could only end badly. But that didn't stop me from finding ways to keep him in my life, to make him a fixture in the quiet, lonely spaces Walter left behind. A few days later, I found myself standing by the phone again, heart pounding as I dialed the repair company's number. Good morning, this is Beatrix Winters again. I believe there's still an issue with the bathroom sink. Could you possibly send Jamal over? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I felt a brief flash of panic. Would they think it strange that I'd requested him specifically? But the operator seemed unfazed. Of course, Mrs. Winters, we'll send him over this afternoon. The hours that followed were a blur. I busied myself with chores that didn't need doing, flitting around the house with a nervous energy. Finally, a knock at the door. Jamal stood there, tools in hand, a knowing look in his eyes that sent a thrill through me. "Back again, Mrs. Winters?" he said with that slight smile, stepping into the foyer. His eyes lingered on me for just a moment longer than they should have, and I felt a familiar heat rise in my cheeks. "Yes, well, it seems the leak is still there. I'm sorry to trouble you again." "It's no trouble at all," he replied, and something in his voice told me he understood exactly why I'd called. He followed me to the bathroom, setting his tools down on the counter with the same quiet confidence. As he crouched to inspect the pipes, I found myself watching him again, feeling a strange sense of vulnerability and exhilaration. This time, our conversation flowed more easily. I learned that he was originally from Georgia, that he had moved up here on his own a few years ago. He talked about his work, the freedom it gave him, and the clients he met along the way. "And what about you, Mrs. Winters?" he asked, looking up at me with those dark, steady eyes. "I mean, this house is beautiful, but don't you get lonely here?" His question caught me off guard. I could feel my defenses slipping, a response forming on my lips before I could stop myself. "Yes," I admitted quietly. I do." The words hung in the air between us, an admission I hadn't even allowed myself to acknowledge until that moment. And in his eyes I saw a flicker of understanding, a kind of unspoken empathy. Before I knew it, we were sitting on the bathroom floor, his hand on my shoulder, his gaze holding mine. It was a small, almost innocent gesture, but it felt like a promise. A dangerous one. "I'd better finish up here," he said after a while, his voice thick with something that felt almost like reluctance. But I didn't let go. My hand stayed on his, and for a brief, reckless moment we sat there in silence, our fingers intertwined. When he finally stood to leave, there was a tension in the air that neither of us acknowledged. I watched him go, heart pounding, already counting down the hours until I could see him again. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next, as I navigated a strange new routine. One where I constantly found myself looking for reasons to see Jamal again, while trying to keep up the appearance of a perfect, untroubled life with Walter. But then, fate intervened once more. One afternoon as I was preparing lunch, the oven suddenly gave a strange hiss, a puff of smoke billowing out from beneath the stovetop. I stepped back, heart racing as the smell of burnt metal filled the kitchen. A call to the repair company was inevitable, but this time it was someone else who arrived at my door. Malik. He was younger, maybe 19, with a quiet, almost brooding energy. His gaze was intense, his eyes taking in everything with a careful, measured scrutiny. "Mrs. Zenat Winters," he greeted me, nodding slightly. "I'm here to take a look at the stove." "Yes, thank you for coming," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. There was something different about Malik, something quieter, more restrained, but I found myself just as intrigued by him. If Jamal had an easygoing charm, Malik had a kind of seriousness that felt grounding, comforting in its own way. As he worked, I lingered nearby, asking questions, making small talk. At first, he seemed reserved, but gradually, he opened up, telling me about his family, his love for fixing things, and his plans to save up enough money to go to college. I could see the drive in him, the determination in his eyes. It was so different from the life I'd built, so far removed from the safety and stability that had become my cage. And before I realized what was happening, I was opening up to him, sharing details about my own life that I hadn't spoken aloud in years. Malik listened patiently, his expression thoughtful, and when he finally looked up from his work, there was a kind of warmth in his gaze that made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in so long. "It must be hard," he said softly, "living like that, feeling trapped." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Yes, it is." Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his arm, and for a brief, electric moment, he didn't pull away. He just looked at me, his gaze steady, unwavering. Then he straightened, his expression careful. I should get back to work. But even as he turned away, I could feel the weight of that moment hanging between us. A silent promise of something more. I watched him as he finished up, my heart racing, wondering what it would be like to let go of everything, to leave behind the life I knew and plunge into the unknown. When he left, I was left standing in the kitchen, feeling both exhilarated and terrified, knowing that I was standing at the edge of a precipice. And for the first time, I was ready to jump. As the days wore on, a strange kind of rhythm settled over my life. I tried to keep everything normal, to follow the familiar routines that Walter expected, but something in me had changed. I knew it, and deep down I suspected he did too. Though Walter rarely questioned my activities, there was a new wariness in his eyes, an edge to his questions whenever he came home. One evening, he looked up from his laptop at dinner and asked, "Bea, have you been redecorating? It seems like every time I come home, there's something different." I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Oh, just little things here and there. You know how I get restless." He nodded, but didn't seem entirely convinced. His eyes lingered on me as if trying to read something he couldn't quite see. And as much as I wanted to brush it off, his questions struck a chord. Because it was true. There were changes, subtle ones, that hinted at my hidden life. The scent of aftershave, lingering faintly in the guest bathroom. A misplaced screwdriver in the kitchen drawer. Each of these details felt like a tiny, dangerous breadcrumb, and yet I found myself unable or unwilling to change course. A few days later, Jamal appeared on my doorstep unannounced. I was surprised, my heart skipping a beat when I opened the door and saw him standing there with that same easy grin. "Just thought I'd check in on that leak," he said casually, though I knew the truth. We both did. Inside, his presence filled the house, making every room seem brighter, every sound sharper. He moved with the ease of someone who belonged, and for a few blissful hours, I let myself forget about everything else. He filled a void in my life I hadn't even realized was there, his laughter and warmth banishing the silence that had haunted me for years. But that evening, as I was preparing for bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. A woman both fulfilled and terrified, teetering on the edge of two worlds. Walter's voice echoed in my mind, his question lingering, and for a moment the weight of what I was risking struck me with full force. It was subtle at first, the way Walter's demeanor changed, the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. But gradually, his suspicions began to seep into our interactions, turning once mundane conversations into tense exchanges. One evening after dinner, he turned to me abruptly. "Did you get the sink fixed?" I froze, then forced myself to smile. "Oh yes, it was just a loose fitting, nothing serious." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. Funny, because I noticed some new charges from the repair company. Seemed like more than just a loose fitting. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression calm. "I may have called them back to double-check. I didn't want to risk another leak." His gaze lingered on me, searching, and for a moment I feared he could see right through me, that he knew exactly what was going on. But then he nodded, his face unreadable. "Just let me know next time," he said quietly, his tone carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place, resentment, perhaps, or hurt. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the familiar thrill of danger mixed with a pang of guilt. For years, I had resented Walter's distance, his absence from our marriage. But now, seeing the toll my actions were taking on him, I felt a flicker of doubt, a whisper that perhaps I'd gone too far. Yet the next morning, as I stood in the quiet kitchen, the memory of Jamal's laughter lingered in my mind, and the doubt faded into the background. I had already crossed a line. There was no turning back now. It was a week later when Malik returned, this time to finish some additional work on the stove. Unlike Jamal, he didn't appear unannounced. He called ahead, his voice calm and professional, but there was a warmth there, a quiet anticipation that made my heart flutter. When he arrived, I could see he'd taken care to look his best. There was a new crispness to his shirt, a gleam in his eyes that hinted at something beyond a simple repair job. As he set to work, we fell into an easy conversation, his quiet, steady presence putting me at ease. But as he worked, I noticed something strange, a subtle shift in his demeanor, a kind of guardedness that hadn't been there before. He glanced at me occasionally, his gaze intense, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "You know, Mrs. Winters, I've seen a lot of people in this line of work, people who have it all but don't realize it, people who take things for granted." The statement hung in the air, and I felt a pang of unease, wondering if he was referring to me. But his gaze softened, and he continued. "Life is complicated," he said quietly. "Sometimes people get lost. They forget what's important. And sometimes they find it in unexpected places." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. His words struck a chord, and I felt an inexplicable sadness, a reminder of the life I'd left behind in my pursuit of something more. But before I could respond, Malik placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of my doubts. Our eyes met, and for a brief, electric moment, there was a connection, a shared understanding, a kind of promise that transcended words. I knew then that he felt something for me too, a pull that neither of us could deny. But as he left that evening, a strange thought crossed my mind, a whisper of suspicion that lingered long after he was gone. Something about his words, his demeanor, it felt almost rehearsed, as if he were playing a role. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the doubt remained, a seed of unease that I couldn't quite shake. A few days later, as I was tidying up the house, I found a small piece of paper tucked under the coffee table. It was crumpled, almost as if someone had tried to throw it away but missed. Curious, I unfolded it, my heart pounding as I read the contents. It was a phone number, scrawled in Malik's handwriting, and next to it a single word, Jamal. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, glances, words exchanged in passing. Malik and Jamal knew each other. I wasn't sure how or why, but the revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so caught up in the thrill and the fantasy that I hadn't stopped to consider the reality of the situation, that there might be something more to their presence in my life than mere coincidence. My pulse quickened, a sickening realization dawning on me. Had they been playing me all along? Was I just another mark, another lonely housewife lured into a trap? The doubt gnawed at me, but I couldn't ignore the lingering connection I felt with them. The part of me that wanted to believe in the sincerity of their words, their actions. And yet, I knew I couldn't let this go. I needed answers. That evening, as Walter came home, I felt a new resolve harden within me. I would confront them, both Jamal and Malik, and uncover the truth. And if they had been deceiving me, using me, then I would make them pay. I wasn't some naive woman who would be played for a fool. Whatever game they were playing, I was ready to turn the tables. The next day I couldn't hold back. I needed answers, and I was ready to get them. I called Jamal and arranged to meet him at a quiet cafe in a part of town where I knew we wouldn't run into anyone who might recognize me. The drive there felt longer than it was, my thoughts swirling with questions and doubts. I tried to calm myself, but the nagging fear gnawed at me. Was I being reckless? What if this was all just some elaborate game? Jamal arrived a few minutes after I did, looking as calm and confident as ever. He greeted me with that easy smile, his eyes warm as he slid into the booth across from me. For a moment, I felt my resolve falter, my anger softening in the face of his charm. But I couldn't afford to be swayed. "So," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's something I need to ask you." He raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly. "All right. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, wondering how to phrase it without sounding paranoid. But I had come this far. There was no turning back now. I found a note with Malik's number. It looked like you two know each other. For a split second, I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or guilt. But he recovered quickly, his expression shifting back to that calm confidence. Malik? He repeated, feigning innocence. Yeah, I know him. We work for the same repair company. His tone was casual, but something about his answer didn't sit right with me. Why didn't you mention it before? He shrugged. Didn't think it mattered. We both do our own thing, you know? Not like we're planning anything together. He chuckled, but the sound felt forced, hollow. My eyes narrowed, studying him. Are you sure about that, Jamal? Because lately I can't shake the feeling that there's more going on here than just a few repairs. The smile faded from his face, and he leaned forward, his expression serious. Listen, Bia, he said quietly, using my name with a familiarity that felt almost like a challenge. I don't know what you're implying, but I'm here because I want to be. No one's forcing me. No games. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that the connection we'd shared was real, that this wasn't just some elaborate scheme. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it. Then why didn't you tell me you knew him? I pressed, my voice sharper than I'd intended. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Because I didn't want to complicate things. I know you've got a life, a husband. I didn't want to give you any more reasons to doubt. His words softened me, but only a little. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the flicker of vulnerability that he rarely showed. And yet, the suspicion lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us thick and unspoken. Finally, he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. Bia, you've got to trust me. I'm here because I care about you. Nothing more, nothing less. His touch sent a familiar warmth through me, and for a moment the doubts melted away. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew that this was far from over. There were still too many questions, too many pieces that didn't quite fit. And I wasn't sure I'd ever get the answers I needed. The confrontation with Jamal left me more conflicted than ever. Part of me wanted to believe him, to let myself be swept up in the fantasy he offered. But another part, a quieter, more rational part, knew that I couldn't ignore the warning signs. There was something about this entire situation that felt wrong, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. A few days later, I decided to pay Malik a visit. He had mentioned his apartment once in passing, and I'd managed to remember the address. It wasn't far, just a modest complex on the outskirts of town. I knew it was a risk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Malik held the key to understanding what was really going on. When I arrived, I found the door slightly ajar. A faint noise coming from inside. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, stepping cautiously into the dimly lit apartment. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A stack of tools on the table next to a worn leather jacket. And then I saw it. A piece of paper lying on the counter, covered in scribbled notes. I leaned in, squinting at the handwriting. It was a list of names. Names I didn't recognize, except for one. Beatrix Winters. My blood ran cold. Why was my name on that list? And who were the others? Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Malik standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Winters, he said slowly, his tone calm but edged with something darker. Didn't expect to see you here. I straightened, forcing myself to remain composed. I wanted to talk to you. About Jamal. About everything. His gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing slightly. What exactly are you trying to find out? My mind raced, grasping for an answer. I need to know if any of this was real. If Jamal, if either of you actually cared, or if it was all just some kind of scheme. Malik's expression softened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something almost like regret, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a cold, guarded look. Maybe it started as a game, he he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But somewhere along the way, things got complicated. His words hung in the air, a confession laced with both truth and ambiguity. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized that I had walked straight into a web of my own making, a trap I had willingly set for myself. That evening, I returned home with my mind reeling, Moloch's words echoing in my thoughts. It was all too much. Too many secrets, too many lies. I had been so consumed by my own desires, my own need for escape, that I hadn't seen the consequences waiting in the shadows. When I walked into the house, I found Walter waiting for me in the living room, his face set in a grim expression. He looked up as I entered, his eyes cold and distant. "Bia?" he said quietly. "We need to talk." The words sent a chill through me, a premonition of the confrontation I had been dreading. I forced myself to meet his gaze, bracing for whatever was to come. "I know you've been seeing someone," he said slowly, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger. "I don't know who, and frankly I don't care, but this ends now." I opened my mouth to protest, to deny everything, but the look in his eyes silenced me. He knew. Somehow he had known all along. "If you want to keep this marriage, this life, you'll put an end to whatever this is," he continued, his voice cold and final. "I'm giving you one chance, Beatrix, one." His ultimatum hung in the air, a line drawn in the sand. I felt a surge of panic, the realization of everything I stood to lose crashing over me like a wave. I had come so close to escaping, to tasting freedom. But now, standing here in the face of Walter's anger, I felt trapped once more. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the silence and the weight of my choices. The next day, my thoughts were a tangled mess, a storm of regret and longing. Walter's words had shaken me, but they hadn't broken the spell that Jamal and Malik had cast over me. Part of me wanted to end things, to return to the safety of my old life. But another part, a part I could no longer deny, craved the thrill, the danger that they offered. In a moment of desperation, I called Jamal. I needed to see him, to feel his presence, to escape the suffocating reality that Walter had forced upon me. When he arrived, he took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" I told him everything. Walter's ultimatum, my fear of losing everything. And as I spoke, I could see a flicker of something dark in his eyes, a glint of ambition or perhaps opportunity. "Maybe it's time to take matters into your own hands," he suggested, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Maybe Walter isn't the only one who gets to make the rules." His words stirred something within me, a reckless impulse that I had kept buried for far too long. I looked at him, my mind racing, a dangerous idea taking root. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jamal leaned in, his gaze intense. "You deserve to be free, B, and sometimes freedom comes with a price." His meaning was clear, and as I looked into his eyes, I felt a surge of both fear and excitement. I knew then that there was no going back. Jamal's words haunted me long after he'd left that night. As I lay in bed beside Walter, I could feel the tension radiating from him, a silent reminder of the ultimatum he'd laid down. The promise of freedom that Jamal had hinted at replayed in my mind like a forbidden melody, one that both thrilled and terrified me. The following morning, I couldn't shake the thoughts. Walter left for the office early, his kiss on my cheek cold and perfunctory, like a man going through the motions. I watched him drive away from the window, my hands clenched around my coffee cup. There was a part of me that still loved him, or perhaps loved the life we'd once shared. But that life felt like a distant memory, a relic of a time when I'd been willing to settle for comfort over passion. As the hours passed, I found myself pacing through the empty house, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a whisper of the life I'd been hiding. I knew what Jamal was offering. He was proposing the unthinkable, suggesting that I could reclaim my life, my freedom, by removing the one obstacle standing in my way. I'd never considered myself capable of something so drastic. And yet, the idea lingered in my mind, a forbidden possibility that promised release from the prison of my marriage. Later that afternoon, I called Jamal, my voice barely steady as I spoke. "I need to see you," I said, the words spilling out before I could reconsider. "Tonight." That evening, we met at a small, secluded park outside of town. The air was thick with humidity, the cicadas humming in the distance as we sat on a bench under the cover of darkness. Jamal's gaze was steady, unyielding, as he waited for me to speak. "I don't know what you're suggesting," I began, my voice trembling. "But if this is something you're serious about, then I need to know what it would mean, what it would cost." He reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch warm and reassuring. "Bia, I wouldn't be suggesting this if I didn't think it was the best way. You deserve a life that's yours, not something dictated by someone else." I searched his eyes, looking for any sign of deceit, any hint that this was just another game. But he looked back at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "How would it even work?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He leaned closer, his voice low. "There are ways. Accidents happen all the time. People slip up, lose control. If you wanted this, I could make it happen." Discreetly. His words were both seductive and terrifying, a promise of liberation wrapped in darkness. The rational part of me screamed to walk away, to forget this ever happened. But the part of me that had been caged, that had felt trapped for so long, whispered that this was my chance. "You'd have to be careful," I said slowly, my voice shaking. "Walter, he's not an easy man to fool." Jamal nodded. "I understand. But I've been around long enough to know how to handle this. If we do it right, no one would ever know." The finality of his words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was my decision, my chance to reclaim my life. And as I looked at Jamal, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: control. For the first time, I held the power to shape my own fate. The days that followed were a blur of careful planning and whispered conversations. Jamal was meticulous, his every move calculated as he walked me through the steps we'd need to take. We spoke in code, never using Walter's name, always meeting in secluded places where no one would recognize us. I could feel the tension building between us, a silent understanding that this was a point of no return. Each time I met with him, I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, a thrill that both terrified and empowered me. I was no longer the passive, obedient wife I'd once been. I was a woman taking charge of her destiny, even if that destiny was shrouded in darkness. One evening, as we sat in my car in an empty parking lot, Jamal laid out the final details of the plan. "He usually drives home late, right? Takes the back road through that wooded area?" I nodded, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. "Yes, he likes to avoid traffic." Jamal glanced at me, his gaze steady. "All you need to do is make sure he's alone. The rest, I'll handle." The simplicity of it was chilling. I felt a pang of guilt, a fleeting moment of doubt, but I pushed it aside. This was my life, my choice. I couldn't afford to let hesitation hold me back now. "All right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'll take care of it." The day of the plan arrived and I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me with each passing hour. Walter left the house early that morning, as usual, his expression tense. I watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread, knowing that this might be the last time I'd see him alive. As the afternoon faded into evening, I prepared myself, going through the motions with a detached sense of calm. I made dinner, set the table, and waited, my heart pounding in my chest as the minutes ticked by. Finally, around 8 o'clock, I heard his car pull into the driveway. He walked in, his face tired, his gaze wary as he looked at me. "Evening, B," he said quietly, his tone cold. There was a distance between us now, a rift that had grown wider with each passing day. "Dinner's ready," I replied, forcing a smile. "I thought we could talk." He raised an eyebrow, glancing at the table. All right. We sat in silence, the tension between us palpable as we picked at our food. I tried to act normal, to hide the guilt that gnawed at me, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, questioning. Finally, he set his fork down, his gaze hard. Is there something you're not telling me, B? I froze, my heart racing. What? What do you mean? He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. You've been different lately, distant, like you're hiding something. The accusation hung in the air, and for a moment I was sure he knew. But I forced myself to stay calm, to meet his gaze with steady composure. I'm just tired, Walter. We've both been through a lot. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded, seeming to accept my answer. All right, but if there's something going on, I'll find out. His words sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder of the man I was dealing with. Walter was not one to be fooled easily, and as he stood to leave, I felt a pang of fear, a sudden doubt that perhaps I'd made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The hours that followed were a blur, a whirlwind of emotions that left me feeling numb. Jamal had executed the plan flawlessly, leaving no trace, no hint of foul play. Walter's car was found the next morning, wrecked in a ravine off the back road he usually took. The police deemed it an accident, a tragic loss, but nothing more. I went through the motions of grief, attending the funeral, accepting the condolences of friends and family. But inside, I felt a strange emptiness, a hollowness that no amount of sympathy could fill. Jamal was there, standing by my side, his presence a reminder of the life I'd chosen. But as the days passed, I found myself questioning everything. My motives, my actions, the price I'd paid for my freedom. One evening, as I sat alone in the empty house, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Malik standing there, his expression unreadable. May I come in? He asked quietly, his tone somber. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the living room, his gaze lingering on the framed photos of Walter and me, the memories of a life that now felt like a distant dream. I know what you did, B, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced, fear gripping me as I looked at him, unable to speak. But I'm not here to judge, he continued, his gaze softening. I thought you should know that Jamal isn't who you think he is. His words sent a chill down my spine, a dawning realization that perhaps I had been deceived once more. And as Malik's revelation unfolded, I knew that my journey was far from over, that the secrets I had uncovered were only the beginning of a much darker truth. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to happen at a family dinner, a vibrator tumbling out of your purse in front of your stepson. But there it was, lying there between the bread basket and the pepper grinder, its delicate pink surface catching the light like some kind of forbidden jewel. And there he was, Owen, staring at it with those piercing blue eyes, his lips twitching, in what could only be described as a mixture of curiosity and amusement. I wanted to die. Victor, my husband, was oblivious, engrossed in some story about the stock market as he poured himself another glass of wine. But Owen saw it. Oh, he saw it. And instead of politely pretending he hadn't, like any decent person would, he leaned forward, his voice calm but with a teasing edge. Meredith? He said, his eyebrows raised. You dropped something. I froze. My face burned hotter than the casserole still steaming in the center of the table. My hands fumbled, snatching the object off the table and stuffing it back into my purse as fast as I could. It's nothing, I stammered, my voice cracking as I avoided his gaze. It didn't look like nothing, he replied, a sly smile playing on his lips. The audacity. I shot him a warning glare, hoping to end the conversation there, but the damage was already done. He'd seen it, and I couldn't unsee the way his expression lingered, curious, playful, and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. Victor, mercifully, remained clueless, muttering something about the NASDAQ, while I buried myself in busy work, clearing plates that didn't need clearing and refilling glasses that were already full. Anything to distract myself from the suffocating embarrassment. That night, after everyone had retreated to their corners of the house, I stayed in the kitchen, scrubbing a spotless countertop as if I could scrub away the memory. But Owen's voice broke the silence. "Hey," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, his tall frame backlit by the dim hallway light. I startled, dropping the sponge into the sink. "Owen," I said, trying to sound composed. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" He smirked. "I could say the same to you." The air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes locked on mine. "Look, I didn't mean to embarrass you earlier," he said, his tone softer now. "I just wasn't expecting that." I let out a nervous laugh, avoiding his gaze as I wiped my hands on a towel. "It was a mistake, a stupid mistake." "Was it?" he asked, his voice lower, more serious. I finally looked up at him, and for the first time, I noticed the intensity in his gaze. He wasn't teasing anymore. There was something deeper there, something that made my stomach flip. I didn't have an answer for him, not one I was ready to admit, anyway. "Good night, Owen," I said firmly, brushing past him and retreating to my room. But even as I closed the door behind me, my heart was racing. I had a sinking feeling that nothing about this was going to be simple. And I was right. That was the night everything began to unravel. I tried to push the incident at the dinner table out of my mind. It was a fluke, an accident that I was determined to forget. Life needed to go back to normal, and I told myself that if I acted like nothing happened, Owen would too. For a few days, it seemed to work. Victor remained oblivious, burying himself in work and spending most evenings in his home office. Owen acted like his usual self, polite, helpful, and occasionally charming in that effortless way he had. But something had shifted. I started noticing Owen more than I should. The way he walked through the house, his easy confidence, the faint scent of cologne he wore that lingered in the hallway. It was subtle at first. Little things that made me realize how different he was from his father. Owen was all vitality, while Victor seemed to have aged overnight in our marriage. Then came the first moment I couldn't ignore. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the house was unusually quiet. Victor had gone out to meet a colleague for golf, and I was reorganizing the bookshelf in the living room, a task I did more for distraction than necessity. Owen wandered in, barefoot and shirtless, holding a basketball under one arm. "Hey," he said casually, dropping onto the couch. His skin was slightly damp from the afternoon heat, and his shorts clung low on his hips. "Hi," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the book in my hand. I felt my pulse quicken but forced myself to focus. "Where's your shirt?" He grinned, tossing the basketball onto the floor. "Too hot. Don't worry, I'm not breaking any rules." "You're definitely breaking some kind of rule," I muttered under my breath, but he heard me and chuckled. "You know," he said after a pause, leaning back against the cushions, "I've been meaning to ask you something." I placed a book on the shelf and turned to him cautiously. "What is it?" "About the other night," he said, his tone soft but deliberate. My stomach dropped. "Owen, I'm not trying to make things weird," he interrupted, holding up his hands as if to calm me. I can't stop thinking about it. About you." My heart pounded in my chest. "We're not having this conversation," I said quickly, but my voice betrayed me, trembling at the edges. "Why not?" he asked, his blue eyes locked on mine. "It's not like I'm imagining things, Meredith. I know you feel it, too." "Feel what?" I snapped, desperate to regain control of the situation. "This," he said simply, gesturing between us. I turned away, grabbing another book off the pile, but my hands were shaking. "You're reading too much into this. I'm your stepmother, Owen." "You're not my mother," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. I had married his father barely 2 years ago, long after Owen had grown up and moved out. Our relationship had always been more cordial than familial. And now it was something else entirely. "I can't do this," I whispered, not even sure if I was speaking to him or to myself. "This is wrong." "Why?" he challenged, standing up and closing the distance between us. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt the heat radiating from his body. "Because it just is," I said, my voice faltering. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze searching mine. "You can tell yourself that all you want," he said quietly, "but it doesn't change the truth." Before I could respond, he turned and left the room, leaving me standing there with my heart racing and my thoughts spinning. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and denial. I threw myself into work, taking on a new interior design project for a local boutique. But it wasn't enough to keep my mind off Owen. I started leaving the house more often, running errands I didn't need to run, just to avoid the charged atmosphere that had settled between us. But Owen wasn't giving up. One evening, I came home late from a client meeting to find him in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, and he looked completely at ease, standing barefoot in front of the stove. "Thought I'd make something for us," he said without looking up. "Where's Victor?" I asked, setting my bag on the counter. "Still at the office," he replied. "I think he said he'd be late." "Great, just the two of us." I hesitated, unsure whether to stay or retreat to my room. But before I could make a decision, Owen turned to me, holding out a glass of wine. "Relax," he said, his voice calm and disarming. "It's just dinner." Reluctantly, I took the glass and sat down at the kitchen island. We ate together in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the occasional hum of conversation. But even in the quiet, the tension was palpable. After dinner, I stood to clear the plates, but Owen stopped me, placing a hand gently on my wrist. "Leave it," he said, his voice low. I froze, his touch sending a jolt through me. "You don't have to run from this, Meredith," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I'm not running," I lied, pulling my hand away. "Yes, you are," he said softly, "and you're going to keep running until you admit what you want." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was right. I had been running. From him, from myself, from the undeniable truth that had been growing between us since that night at the dinner table. But admitting it was too dangerous. Without another word, I turned and left the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked myself in my bedroom, leaning against the door as I tried to catch my breath. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That Owen wasn't going to let me go so easily. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. A week passed, and the tension between Owen and me felt like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter, fraying just enough to make me wonder when it might snap. I avoided him as much as I could, but the house wasn't big enough to keep our worlds from colliding. It was a Friday night when everything came to a head. Victor had flown to Chicago for a business trip and wouldn't be back until Sunday evening, leaving Owen and me alone in the house. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could handle being around him without slipping. But that night proved how wrong I was. I'd poured myself a glass of wine and settled on the couch to watch an old movie, trying to quiet my restless thoughts. The house was dark and still, except for the glow of the television. Halfway through the film, I heard footsteps. Owen appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed, a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was dressed casually in sweatpants and a plain t-shirt, but there was something about the way he carried himself, so relaxed yet deliberate, that made my pulse quicken. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Not really," he replied, stepping into the room. "You." I held up my wine glass. "This helps." He chuckled softly and walked over to sit beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. My heart thudded in my chest, but I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, pretending not to notice how his knee brushed against mine. "What are you watching?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. Casablanca was playing, the iconic scene of Rick and Ilsa's bittersweet goodbye unfolding on the screen. "Just an old classic," I said, taking a sip of wine to steady myself. He leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the couch, his fingers almost grazing my shoulder. "I've never seen it." "You should. It's complicated, but beautiful." For a moment, we sat in silence, the movie playing on, but I couldn't focus. The tension between us crackled like static electricity, and I could feel his eyes on me, studying me. Finally, I turned to him, intending to say something to break the spell, but the words died on my lips. He was so close, his expression unreadable but intense. And then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're beautiful, Meredith." The room seemed to tilt. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "Owen, don't." "I mean it," he interrupted, his gaze never wavering. "I don't think you hear it enough. You deserve to hear it." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, leaning closer. Because, my voice faltered as I searched for an answer, but the truth was, I didn't have one. At least, not one that felt honest. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I stood abruptly, clutching my wine glass like a lifeline. I should go to bed, I said, my voice shaky. But as I turned to leave, Owen caught my wrist, his touch firm but gentle. Meredith, wait. I froze, unable to look at him. Please, don't make this harder than it already is, I whispered. Look at me, he said softly. Against my better judgment, I turned, and the vulnerability in his eyes undid me. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the only sound the faint hum of the television. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, I found myself leaning in. The first brush of his lips against mine was tentative, hesitant, but it sent a shockwave through me. I should have stopped it, pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I let myself sink into the kiss, the taste of him intoxicating and forbidden. When we finally broke apart, I was trembling, my mind racing with 1,000 reasons why this was a mistake. But when I met his gaze, all I could see was the raw, unguarded longing in his eyes. Tell me you don't want this, he said, his voice barely audible. I couldn't. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, the events of the night before playing in my mind like a reel I couldn't pause. I felt a mix of emotions, shame, exhilaration, and a deep, gnawing fear of what came next. I told myself it had been a one-time lapse, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew better. The way he'd touched me, the way he'd made me feel alive again. It was like a drug I couldn't quit. And sure enough, it didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, we found ways to be alone, stealing moments when Victor wasn't around. The secrecy of it all only heightened the intensity, making every glance, every touch feel electric. One evening, after Victor had left for another business trip, Owen and I ended up at a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was seedy and nondescript, the kind of place people went to disappear. As we lay tangled together in the dimly lit room, the weight of what we were doing pressed down on me. We can't keep doing this, I murmured, my fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. We don't have to stop, he said, his voice steady. We just have to be careful. Careful. The word felt like a cruel joke. No matter how cautious we were, the truth was a ticking time bomb, and I had no idea when it might explode. The fallout began sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I was working on a new design project for a wealthy client, Roger Haskins, who owned several properties in the area. He was charming but overbearing, the kind of man who always got what he wanted. As I walked him through the plans for his latest renovation, his flirtations became more overt. You have an eye for detail, he said, his gaze lingering on me longer than it should have. I can see why Victor married you. I forced a polite smile, ignoring the unease that prickled at the back of my neck. But the tension escalated when he brushed against me, his hand lingering on my waist. Roger, please, I said, stepping away. He smirked, as if amused by my resistance. Come on, Meredith, don't act like you don't enjoy the attention. The encounter left me rattled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Roger wouldn't let things go so easily. Meanwhile, Owen's ex-girlfriend, Lila, had started coming around more often. She was sweet on the surface, but there was a sharpness to her that put me on edge. One evening, as I passed by Owen's room, I heard her voice, low and sultry. You've been different lately, she said. Distracted. Is there someone else? I didn't hear his response, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Lila was no fool, and the thought of her discovering our secret sent a wave of panic through me. By the time Victor returned from his trip, the cracks in our lives had begun to show. He noticed my distracted demeanor, questioned my late nights and sudden interest in working outside the house. Is everything okay? He asked one evening as we sat in the living room. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. But the truth was, everything was far from okay. The web of lies I'd spun was growing more tangled by the day, and I had no idea how long I could keep it from unraveling. The secrecy that once felt exhilarating now became suffocating. Every stolen glance with Owen, every hushed conversation, and every locked door felt like a ticking bomb. It wasn't just the guilt. I could live with that, twisted as it sounds, but the growing fear of being discovered. And it didn't help that Owen was becoming bolder. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find him leaning against the counter, sipping coffee like he hadn't a care in the world. I froze when I noticed Victor at the table, typing furiously on his laptop, blissfully unaware of Owen's lingering gaze on me as I grabbed a mug. "Morning, Meredith," Owen said, his tone casual, but the slight smirk curling at the edge of his lips said otherwise. "Good morning," I replied, not daring to meet his eyes. Victor glanced up briefly. "I'll be working late tonight," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "That damn audit is taking up all my time." Owen didn't miss the opportunity. "Guess it'll just be the two of us then," he said, his voice deceptively light. I shot him a warning look, but he ignored it, taking another sip of coffee, as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" Victor didn't notice. He was already buried in his work again, oblivious to the undercurrent that had taken over the room. Later that night, with Victor still at the office, Owen knocked softly on my bedroom door. I shouldn't have let him in. Every rational part of me screamed to send him away, to lock the door and pretend he wasn't there. But when I opened it, the sight of him, his tousled hair, his piercing blue eyes, left me defenseless. "We shouldn't," I whispered as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We shouldn't," he agreed. But the way his hand brushed against my arm told me he had no intention of stopping. Our relationship spiraled deeper into the dangerous territory of familiarity. We found excuses to be alone, each encounter feeling riskier than the last. One night, we drove to a secluded park on the outskirts of town, parking under the cover of dense trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting shadows that felt like a protective cloak around us. "Do you ever think about how this ends?" I asked him, as we sat in the car, the silence of the woods pressing in around us. He turned to me, his expression serious for once. "Do you want it to end?" I didn't have an answer. But life had a way of forcing answers out of you, whether you were ready for them or not. One evening, as I worked late in my office at home, Lila arrived unannounced. She'd been coming around more often, and while Owen claimed she was harmless, I could see the sharp edge behind her smiles. "Hey, Meredith," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Is Owen around?" I looked up from my desk, trying to keep my expression neutral. "I think he's out running errands. Did you need something?" She shrugged, stepping into the room without an invitation. "Not really. I just wanted to chat, get to know you better." I forced a smile. "Well, I'm always happy to chat. What's on your mind?" Lila tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "You've been married to Victor for what, 2 years now?" "That's right," I said, keeping my tone light. "And Owen, he seems pretty comfortable around you," she said, her words carefully measured. "I guess it must be nice having someone younger around the house, keeping things lively." The comment hit too close to home, and I had to fight to keep my composure. "Owen's a great kid," I said, my voice steady but tight. Lila smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Kid. Right." I didn't know how much she knew, or suspected, but the conversation left me rattled. The pressure intensified when Roger, my overly flirtatious client, started crossing more boundaries. He began calling at odd hours, his tone becoming less professional with each conversation. At first, I brushed it off, but one day he showed up at the house unannounced, a bottle of wine in hand. "I thought we could go over the project details," he said, his smile too wide. Victor was out, and Owen was upstairs, thankfully out of sight. I reluctantly let Roger in, trying to keep the visit brief, but he lingered, sitting too close on the couch as he flipped through my portfolio. "You've got a real talent, Meredith," he said, his hand grazing mine. "But you know that already, don't you?" I stood abruptly, pulling my hand away. "Thank you, Roger, but I think we've gone over everything we need to." His smile faltered, but he didn't argue. As he left, I watched from the window, my stomach churning. I had a sinking feeling Roger wasn't the type to take rejection lightly. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Victor had planned a small gathering at the house to celebrate a recent business deal. It was supposed to be a casual evening with close friends and colleagues, but the atmosphere was anything but relaxed. Roger was there, his gaze following me like a predator watching its prey. Lila had also shown up, uninvited but with a reason to stay. She claimed she was Owen's date. I avoided both of them as best I could, but the evening felt like walking a tightrope. Every glance from Roger, every knowing smirk from Lila, made the walls feel like they were closing in. At one point, I caught Lila cornering Owen in the hallway. I couldn't hear their conversation, but her body language was aggressive, her gestures sharp and pointed. Owen looked calm, but his jaw was tight, a sign he was holding back. Later, as the party wound down, I found myself alone in the kitchen, rinsing glasses and trying to steady my nerves. That's when Lila appeared, her heels clicking against the tile floor. "You're good at this," she said, leaning against the counter. "Playing the perfect wife, the perfect stepmother." I froze, the glass in my hand slipping slightly under the running water. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," she said, her voice dripping with venom. The look in her eyes sent a chill down my spine. She knew. Before I could respond, Owen entered the kitchen, his expression dark. "Lila, let's go," he said firmly. She smirked, pushing off the counter. "Sure, for now." As she left, I turned to Owen, my heart pounding. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing I can't handle," he said, his jaw clenched. "But we need to be more careful." More careful. It felt like we were already walking on a knife's edge, and I didn't know how much longer we could keep our balance. The next day, I received a cryptic text from Roger. "We need to talk. Soon." My stomach churned as I stared at the message. I had no idea what he wanted, but I had a feeling it wasn't just about business. And as if that weren't enough, Lila's parting words echoed in my mind. She wasn't going to let this go, not without a fight. The life I'd so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble, and I could feel the cracks spreading, threatening to swallow me whole. Victor's suspicions grew slowly but steadily, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He didn't say much at first, just observed with a quiet intensity that set me on edge. Owen, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, or maybe just bolder. The way he carried himself around the house, brushing past me in the hallway, or giving me those lingering looks, felt like he wanted us to get caught. The pressure was mounting, and I wasn't handling it well. My work suffered. I found myself distracted during meetings, zoning out while my clients discussed their visions. Even Roger noticed. "You seem preoccupied," he said one afternoon as we reviewed fabric samples in his downtown office. "I'm fine," I replied curtly, but he didn't buy it. Roger leaned back in his chair, studying me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Trouble at home?" he asked, his tone almost gleeful. I forced a polite smile, unwilling to give him any more ammunition. "Nothing I can't handle." But as I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Roger wasn't done with me. The situation with Lila reached a boiling point a week later. She showed up at the house unannounced, her tone clipped and her eyes sharp as she asked to speak with Owen. I tried to give them privacy, retreating to the kitchen, but their voices carried through the thin walls. "Who is it, Owen?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "Who's the woman you're seeing?" "You're imagining things," Owen said calmly, but I could hear the strain in his voice. "Don't lie to me," Lila snapped. "I can feel it, you're hiding something." I clenched my fists, my heart racing as I waited for the argument to end. When Lila finally stormed out, slamming the front door behind her, I found Owen in the living room, pacing like a caged animal. "She knows," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She suspects," I corrected, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. He looked at me, his jaw tight. "What are we going to do?" "We need to be more careful," I said, my voice shaking. "This can't come out, Owen. It would destroy everything." Owen stepped closer, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and longing. "I don't care about everything, Meredith. I care about you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. As much as I wanted to believe him, the reality was far more complicated. I had a husband, a career, a life that couldn't withstand the truth. The secret rendezvous became our lifeline. We found creative ways to see each other without raising suspicion. There was the park at the edge of town, where we sat in my car, talking in hushed tones until the windows fogged up. There was the motel on Route 17, where the front desk clerk didn't even bother to look up when we walked in separately. But it wasn't enough. The more we tried to keep our distance at home, the more the tension built. One evening, as I was unloading groceries in the kitchen, Owen walked in. Victor was in his office upstairs, the door closed as usual. "I can't do this anymore," Owen said, his voice low but urgent. I froze, a carton of eggs in my hands. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Pretending like you don't mean everything to me." Owen, he stepped closer, his intensity making my breath hitch. I'm serious, Meredith. I don't care about the consequences. I just want you. You don't mean that? I whispered, though my resolve was crumbling with every step he took toward me. Yes, I do, he said, his voice firm. And you do, too. Before I could respond, he kissed me, his hands framing my face as if he couldn't bear to let me go. For a moment, I let myself forget the world outside the kitchen, the lies, the guilt, the ticking clock that was bound to catch up with us. The sound of a door opening upstairs brought us back to reality. I pulled away, my heart pounding as I grabbed the nearest grocery bag and shoved it onto the counter. Go, I whispered urgently, nodding toward the back door. Owen hesitated, his eyes searching mine, but the sound of Victor's footsteps made the decision for him. He slipped out the door just as Victor entered the kitchen, his gaze sweeping the room. Everything okay? He asked, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. Fine, I said quickly, my voice a little too high-pitched, just putting away the groceries. Victor watched me for a moment, then nodded and walked to the fridge to grab a beer. I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling as I resumed unpacking the bags. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday, and Victor had invited a few colleagues over for drinks and dinner. I spent the afternoon cleaning and preparing appetizers, trying to focus on the mundane tasks to keep my mind off Owen, who had conveniently decided to visit a friend for the day. As the guests arrived, I played the role of the perfect hostess, laughing at their jokes and refilling their glasses. But the evening took an unexpected turn when Roger showed up, uninvited. Meredith, he said, his smile smug as he handed me a bottle of wine. Couldn't resist crashing the party. I forced a smile, though my stomach churned. Victor didn't seem to mind, ushering Roger into the living room and introducing him to the other guests. But Roger's attention was on me. Throughout the evening, he found excuses to corner me, his comments growing more suggestive with each drink he had. You're wasted on Victor, you know that? He said at one point, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Stop, I hissed, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Roger smirked, leaning closer. You don't have to play the dutiful wife with me. I know what you really want. Before I could respond, Owen walked in. He froze when he saw Roger standing so close to me, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked between us. What's going on? He asked, his voice sharp. Nothing, I said quickly, stepping away from Roger. But Owen wasn't buying it. Were you bothering her? He demanded, his tone cold. Roger raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Relax, kid. It's just a conversation. It didn't look like just a conversation, Owen shot back, his fists clenching at his sides. Stop it, I said, my voice trembling. Both of you. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I could see Victor watching us from across the room, his expression unreadable. I think you should leave, Owen said, his voice steady but dangerous. Roger smirked again, but didn't argue. He tipped his glass toward me in a mock toast, then sauntered out the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor approached, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Owen and me. What the hell was that about? He asked. Nothing, I said quickly. Roger had too much to drink. Victor didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned and went back to his guests, leaving Owen and me alone in the hallway. You didn't have to do that, I whispered. Yes, I did, Owen said firmly. I stared at him, my heart pounding as I realized just how close we were to everything unraveling. We can't keep this up, I said, my voice barely audible. But Owen's expression was resolute. I'm not letting you go, Meredith. Not now. Not ever. I should have known it would all fall apart eventually. Secrets like ours don't stay buried for long, especially not in a house filled with suspicious glances and unspoken tensions. But it wasn't Victor or Lila who discovered us. It was something far worse. It happened during a family gathering on a warm Saturday afternoon. Victor, ever the charming host, had invited a few colleagues over for drinks and grilling in the backyard. I spent the morning setting up, forcing myself to smile and make small talk, while Owen drifted in and out of the kitchen, his presence a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed. Lila arrived midway through the afternoon, uninvited but expected. She had been dropping by more frequently, her sudden interest in Owen coinciding with her growing curiosity about me. She'd always been sharp, too sharp, and I could tell she was watching me, studying the way my eyes lingered on Owen for a second too long, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. I tried to stay composed, but the air felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle. At one point, I caught Lila whispering to Owen in the corner of the yard, her eyes flicking toward me. He brushed her off, but her expression hardened. The gathering wound down as the sun set, guests trickling out one by one. Victor was still outside with his last colleague, laughing over a bottle of scotch, when Lila made her move. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up when she appeared in the doorway, holding something small and silver in her hand. "Looking for this?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. My heart stopped. It was a necklace, mine. The delicate chain, a gift from Owen, had slipped off during one of our motel meetings. I'd noticed it missing days ago but hadn't dared to ask him about it. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She smiled, a predator's smile. "I stopped by the Valley Inn yesterday. Room 212, right?" Imagine my surprise when I saw the guest list. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. "Lila." "Save it," she snapped, stepping closer. "I don't need an explanation, I know exactly what's going on." I swallowed hard, trying to think of a way to diffuse the situation. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her voice cold. "You're screwing your stepson. I saw the way you looked at him today, the way he looked at you. It's disgusting." Her words hit like a slap, and I opened my mouth to argue, but she cut me off again. "Don't worry," she said, slipping the necklace into her pocket. "I won't tell Victor, yet, but you'd better pray I don't change my mind." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my world crumbling around me. Lila didn't go to Victor right the damage was done. Knowing she held our secret over my head was unbearable. Every time she came over, every time she glanced at me with that smug smile, I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Owen tried to reassure me, insisting she wouldn't dare expose us, but I wasn't so sure. Lila had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and she wasn't the only threat. Victor was growing more suspicious by the day, his questions more pointed, his demeanor colder. Then the final blow came from an unexpected source. One evening, as I sat in the living room trying to pretend everything was fine, Victor burst through the front door, his face flushed with anger. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and furious. I froze. "What is it?" He threw a stack of papers onto the coffee table. Bank statements. Transactions I didn't recognize. "You've been siphoning money from our joint account," he accused, his voice shaking with rage. "What?" I gasped, grabbing the papers. "I haven't." "Don't lie to me, Meredith," he snapped. "There are thousands missing. Do you think I wouldn't notice?" I stared at the statements, my mind racing. I hadn't touched the account, but the evidence was damning. And then it hit me. Roger had been flirting with me for weeks, and I'd brushed it off as harmless. But now I realized he must have gained access to my financial information somehow, likely through our work together on his renovation project. "I didn't take the money," I said firmly, meeting Victor's glare. He scoffed. "Then who did? Because it didn't disappear on its own." The argument escalated, our voices rising until Owen appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes darting between us. "Stay out of this," Victor snapped, but Owen didn't back down. He stepped between us, his protective instincts kicking in, and that's when Victor's suspicions boiled over. "What are you even doing here?" he demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're always around, hovering. It's like you don't have a life of your own." Owen's jaw tightened. "Maybe I just care about what happens in this house." Victor laughed bitterly. "Or maybe you've got something to hide, just like her." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, I thought he might say it, might accuse us outright. But instead he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The fallout was inevitable. Victor filed for divorce a week later, citing irreconcilable differences. He never found out about Owen and me, or if he did, he never said. But the damage was done. Lila, true to her word, kept quiet, though not out of kindness. She'd made it clear that her silence came with a price. Owen was hers now. Or so she thought. Owen, however, had other plans. He left town shortly after the divorce was finalized, leaving me a note that was equal parts apology and confession. "I love you." It read. But this can't go on. Not like this. I couldn't blame him. What we had was never meant to last, and deep down, I'd always known it. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I moved into a small apartment, far from the house I'd once shared with Victor, and threw myself into my work. The scandal with Roger eventually came to light, and while it cleared my name, it did little to erase the damage. As for Owen, I heard whispers of him now and then, a new job in another city, a fleeting relationship with someone his own age. But he never reached out, and neither did I. Sometimes late at night, I'd find myself thinking about him, about the choices we'd made and the lines we'd crossed. I didn't regret the way he made me feel, alive, desired, but I couldn't deny the cost. Sitting alone in my newly decorated living room, I sipped a glass of wine and stared out the window. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the storm I'd weathered. I'd lost everything, my marriage, my home, my sense of stability, but I'd also gained something I hadn't expected: clarity. Sometimes the things that break us are the same things that set us free.